Today we continue the story of the Zaporozhets. If you haven't seen the first part yet, make sure to check it out before watching this one. In this episode, we'll talk about the car that replaced the hunchback Zaz 965 on the assembly line. When the Zaz 965 went into mass production in 1960, its shortcomings quickly became apparent. It had a cramped cabin, tiny trunk, frequent overheating in hot weather, and an outdated design. Fixing these flaws wasn't possible without a complete redesign. That's why, as early as spring 1961, engineers at the Zaporozhye automobile plant began work on a brand new model informed by real-world experience with the 965. By November of the same year, an early prototype was showcased at the USSR's National Exhibition in Moscow. But progress was slow. The Zaz design team lacked experience. The original Zaporozhets had actually been designed in Moscow, not in Zaporizhzhia. As a result, mass production of the second-generation Zaporozhets didn't begin until 1966. And even then, it launched with a temporary engine, a repurposed version of the old one, earning the model the name Zaz 966V, where V stood for temporary. This stopgap engine, the MEMS 966V, had 887 cubic centimeters of displacement and produced between 27 and 30 horsepower, using a draw-through cooling fan. It was eventually replaced in 1968 by the proper engine the model was designed for, the MEMS 968, producing up to 43 horsepower from 1.2 liters. Some variants, including those adapted for drivers with disabilities, continued to use the older engine for years. The new body was significantly larger, about 40 centimeters longer and 14 centimeters wider than before. And for Soviet drivers, that was a big deal. Unlike in the West, people in the USSR didn't really think in terms of car segments or classes. Sure, official classifications existed on paper, but in practice, car buyers simply asked themselves one question: what can I afford? And within that budget, the bigger the car, the better. That made the more spacious, more imposing Zaz 966 a welcome upgrade and a desirable purchase for many. Now let's talk about what the new Zaporozhets looked like. Early prototypes had a more original appearance, but the production version, the Zaz 966, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the German NSU Prinz. However, the Prinz itself, along with a number of other rear-engine cars of the 1960s, drew heavily from the same source, the American Chevrolet Corvair. Unveiled in 1959, the Corvair became one of the most copied cars of its time. Its clean, beltline-wrapped styling inspired the design of cars all over the world. The British Hillman Imp, Italian Fiat 1300, French Renault R8, and Simca 1000, Japanese Hino Contessa, and Mazda 800, and even American vans like the Dodge A100. The Corvair was the trendsetter, and everyone else followed. But while the Zaz 966 did resemble the NSU Prinz, it was fundamentally a very different car. Its construction, proportions, and technical layout were unrelated. The Zaporozhets had a longitudinal engine, while the NSU had a transverse one. And unlike the earlier Zaz 965, which borrowed heavily from the Fiat 600, even down to the panel stamping process, the Zaz 966 didn't copy anything so directly. Interestingly, there are records showing that the Soviet Automotive Institute NAMI acquired a Chevrolet Corvair and sent it either to the Zaporozhye plant or the Melitopol engine factory for study. particularly its air cooling system. So, while the Corvair might have been the main source of inspiration, the designers at Cominar tried not to just clone it. Unlike NSU, who basically miniaturized the Corvair's look for the European market, the Soviet team aimed for something more original, albeit in the same visual language. Unfortunately, despite all the upgrades and design changes, the main issue remained unsolved. The engine still overheated. Just like its predecessor, the Zaz 966 used an air-cooled engine. To fight overheating, engineers added large air intakes on the rear fenders. These distinctive ears earned the car its famous nickname, the big-eared Zaporozhets. But those scoops didn't really help. The engine continued to overheat in summer, and in winter, it struggled to warm up properly. Interestingly, in 1968, the car was shown at the Brussels Motor Show under a different name, the Yalta 1000. Even more surprising, under the hood was a Renault engine. This was part of an ambitious, but ultimately failed plan for joint production with the Belgian company Skaldia Volga. Still, the Zaz 966 was exported, though with its original Soviet engine. Export markets included countries within the Eastern Bloc, and even a few in Western Europe. In 1970, the Zaporozhets received an update, what we'd now call a facelift. The new model was named Zaz 968, and it was an evolutionary redesign of the previous Zaz 966. It was produced from 1970 to 1979. At first, changes were barely noticeable. In fact, the two models were manufactured side by side for several years. Early 968s looked almost identical to the 966, with only small differences, like the addition of reverse lights and a new dashboard layout. In late 1973, the car was mildly restyled. The fake front grille was replaced with a slim chrome strip, and the lighting was modernized. Mechanically, it remained the same. The 968 was also exported. But unlike the previous model, it wasn't marketed as Yalta. This time, it proudly kept its Soviet name, Zaporozhets. Even though it was technically a new model, most Soviet drivers couldn't really tell the difference between the 966 and 968. Still, the Zaz 968 had one unusual version, an electric one. In 1973, engineers at the Zaporizhzhia Institute of Mechanical Engineering built a prototype called the Zaz 968 Electro. It looked just like a regular Zaporozhets on the outside, but under the hood was a set of electric motors and lead-acid batteries. This electric Zaporozhets could accelerate to 60 kilometers per hour, about 37 miles per hour, in just 8 seconds. On a full charge, it could travel around 100 kilometers, or 60 miles. But the batteries were extremely heavy, around 400 kilograms. That made mass production impractical. The electric Zaporozhets remained a prototype. The era of EVs simply hadn't arrived yet. But still, you've got to respect the experiment. In 1979, the Zaporozhets received its final major facelift. And this time, the changes were more substantial. The styling was updated again, but most importantly, the engine finally saw some improvements. It was still an air-cooled V4, but now it produced 45 horsepower. The most important upgrade was the new cooling system. Instead of the signature side air intakes, the ears that gave the car its nickname, the updated model had smaller vents or gills in the rear fenders. The right side served as an air intake, while the left side was used for exhaust. The main cooling air now entered through a stamped grille on the engine lid. A redesigned fan with improved blade geometry offered better airflow with less noise, and lower engine load. In theory, this solved the overheating issue. In practice, not so much, unless you kept the engine fins scrupulously clean. Overheating was still common. Despite that, this version, known as the ZAZ 968M, became the most common and iconic Zaporozhets of all. For many Soviet drivers, it was their first car, the one they learned to drive and repair on. Unfortunately, it never received any major upgrades again. The USSR was entering a period of economic stagnation, and the 968 million became stuck in time. In the second half of 1987, following the launch of the front-wheel drive Tavria, which I'll cover in the next video, the price of the ZAZ 968M was reduced from 5,375 to 3,900 rubles, just to keep it selling. Remarkably, the car remained in production all the way until 1994, well into the post-Soviet era of independent Ukraine. But by then, exports were limited strictly to the Eastern Bloc. One of the more unusual versions of the 968M was a pickup truck. That's right, a rear-engined pickup. Earlier models had pickup variants, but only for in-factory use. With the 968M, the pickup version was produced in small numbers, about 2,500 units, mainly for government and utility services. In addition, every generation of the Zaporozhets had a version specially designed for disabled drivers, something the factory became known for. These cars featured hand controls and other modifications to allow people with limited mobility to drive them independently. And just like before, they were provided free of charge through the Soviet social welfare system and given directly to the recipient as personal property. By the way, I have a separate video on this topic. The link is in the description. A total of around 3.1 million ZAZ 966 and 968 models were produced between 1967 and 1994. In total, from 1967 to 1994, 1960 to 1994, the Zaporozhets line, including the ZAZ 965, 966, and 968, reached 3,422,444 units. Despite all its flaws, the Zaporozhets became a true people's car. It gave millions of Soviet citizens access to personal transportation and gave drivers with disabilities a sense of independence. Noisy, underpowered, and often overheating, it was still beloved. Decades later, the Zaporozhets remains a symbol of a vanished era, one that still brings smiles and a strong dose of nostalgia.